Do you think the art market is catching up now to what African art is, or is it still behind and still dipping their toes a little bit, or they're now diving in?
In some ways, they're catching up. I think the first mistake I think that we had to really work on in changing this perception is when you were talking about contemporary African art. I think the world was thinking, of anthropology, like maybe the craft, the mask, the what they called at the time tribal art. What I was not expecting was the sold out of those very brave, 17 galleries playing the game with me, and participating to the first edition of 154. It was basically in response of the lack of representation of artists from the continent and from the diaspora.
Welcome, Touria. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Good. No, absolute pleasure. So before I jump into the questions, it would be good to hear more about yourself and what you do.
So I'm Touria El Glaoui. I'm the founding director of 154 Contemporary African Art Fair. It is a platform and a project that I've started almost 14 years ago, and with the mission of representing artists from Africa and the African diaspora. It was basically in response of the lack of representation of artists from the continent and from the diaspora on the international market. I saw, in general, a gap, and I was trying to understand what it was all about, first of all. I'm the daughter of an artist, who, with a lot of luck, has had an amazing career in Morocco, so quite established, but still with a lot of difficulty and barriers, to get a very, I want to say, visible international career. So I think the response of building 154 was definitely a lesson learned from my father career, and what worked for him, what did not work for him, and my visits on the continent with my previous professional role, which has nothing to do with art, but made me discover the African continent in its full beauty.
Yeah.
And I think understanding, the talent that I was lucky enough to discover on the continent, and really coming back to Europe where I was living, or in the US where I was often working, and not seeing any trace of what I was experiencing on the continent really kind of like triggered something, I think, in me. But also, I think the inside story of my dad helped me a lot to understand what was lacking in this whole system. But that's a bit about me, about my professional life.
That's amazing. And you talked about the old profession, which you started off in finance before.
Yes.
And a lot of people who I speak into, they're like, how do I go from corporate to something creative? How did you go from working in finance to this, and what was it that you saw that was like, what, I found something and I'm going to chase it?
I think, there's not one particular moment in time. I think, we all today probably have 1, 2, 3 careers. I think the first one coming out of finance, was obviously with trying to find a positioning with my skills, that I went for school for, So finance seems to be what, I was thinking I wanted to go with my background. But I'm extremely, extremely privileged to have been able to work in this corporate environment, because it took me to Africa. And even though I was born in Africa, I think if you're a bit privileged and a bit about worrying about your education, your parents are like pushing you to go, abroad. And definitely, in terms of discovery, I can't remember one trip we took with my parents on the continent, So I think my professional career being this regional sales, person, for this big corporate company covering Middle East and Africa was a real eye-opener for my life, for who I was, to my roots, like in general. And I believe that, that, everything has a timing for it. I'm not completely coming from, a corporate world to art, because I think the idea of growing up with a father as an artist is very different than, seeing your dad going to work from 9 to 5. My father was based at home. I saw him every morning, having a very relaxed breakfast, then working in his studio, who was always in the heart of our home. And also I was seeing, all those collectors coming to the house, all those galleries, negotiating with my dad, those dealers, So I think there's definitely something that was,
embedded in you from there.
Embedded in me without me knowing, and I think I became much more aware of it when my father got older and slowed down a bit, and I was trying to support a bit when I was coming back and forth from my corporate life back home, and I was seeing him struggling a bit about accepting big project because he was alone. He was very old school artist. He didn't have a studio with 20 people working for him. It was really him doing everything during his prime time. And when he got older, he was a bit worried about all the organization behind, big show abroad. So this is where I thought, I could help him and support him, not to give him any visibility he didn't need to, but like to just get on board with the admin stuff of, his career. And I think that also helped me understood, a bit of the back office of an artist, what are the pain points, when you're based in Africa. And I heard and read a lot about my father's career about, when he had those 15 years abroad, how easy it was for him to get, those, European galleries, doing shows, knowing that transport and shipping, all this was a very different story then. And the pace was also very different. But he had the opportunity to be very present in the European market and then came back in Africa with a bit of an establishment himself. Back in Morocco, he was already a sign artist with several galleries. What was lacking for him in Morocco was the infrastructure. There was no galleries when he came back. There was no institutions. So all those things that are still often lacking on the continent, really were things, I got through his career. But I think, you can move from corporate to the art world, but there's definitely some little level of layers I understood, I guess, before, jumping.
Yeah, it was almost like your core, seeing your dad do the art thing, seeing his problems, all the holes. So you think, I could help with that, I could help with this. It kind of just, navigated to what you're doing right now in terms of helping visual artists and other places do those things. Talking more about 154 lightly, launching in London was like the first turning point. What changed for you after you did the first edition and you made this thing come to life?
I think I definitely saw a change, when we finished our first edition with all the fear you have when you start a project like that, when you go on your own as an entrepreneur. I'm like fast forwarding all those 2 years of prep, but the first edition, I think, where we were quite aware that it could not work, that there would be area of development, as any first launch, But what I was not expecting was the sold out of those very brave, 17 galleries playing the game with me, and participating to the first edition of 154. I think in one way they were quite aware, the artist, the dealer, they were quite aware about the fact that they had extremely good talent in their hands, and the market was ready for this. But I guess the fact that, you had no recognition from, I guess, the ecosystem around you, was very worry when we started. And I think the first edition with the sold out, with the international press, giving us the time, and the collectors, the institution coming at the first edition, telling each other that this was the new place to be, and discover those artists. I think, the the fact that we were ready and the access, what was lacking, kind of give me, I want to say, a certain confidence for the second edition, for, that where we were at and our ambition were the correct ones to have, in terms of building this platform, giving visibility to artists, knowing there will be a demand at the end of the tunnel. It was not just me having an idea, galleries willing to take part, and actually, it was a bit of a lottery, but at the same time, I think my own eye, I thought I trusted it in terms of what I was seeing on the continent, thinking people were extremely talented. I couldn't understand the reason why they were not crossing over, you know? So I think this proved basically the concept, that it was correct, that people were interested, it was they didn't have access. And I think, of course, the second edition where, we saw another extremely successful edition, in a way, us registering into this Art Week system that, people have installed before us, and then people being like, okay, we need to go to 154. We missed this last time, we have to be there. Also, the collectors hurrying to not lose, the time to acquire something at 154. I think all this shifted, the perception of contemporary African art on the second year already. You know? And I think for me, that was I guess the biggest shift, from understanding that from an idea we're moving to something that was extremely needed, that was, even more on the second year, I understood how the gap was large, in terms of accelerating the inclusion of those artists into the global, international market, and understanding a bit more the ecosystem I was working with that was existing, in the West, and where we needed to, play the game or registered ourselves as something where people had to come to see us. But I think the first year, definitely, you had all the worry of having it to work. The second year was kind of like, okay, we're here to stay. There's definitely a need. And then also an understanding of where do we need to go next, basically, to make sure that we can accelerate this visibility and this inclusion. And this is where, at the end of, I think, the second year, I knew I was going to New York, because this was, the other main hub, of contemporary art. And I knew about the number of institutions that were present in the US and the largest number of collectors we had to reach out. So we kind of understood the blueprint of London and how, it became successful to be around around the satellite art fair of a bigger show. I didn't mind to be the satellite art fair. And we kind of replicated what worked, in London to do it in New York, and I think the blueprint worked, at least for the first 5 years, very strongly. And also, keeping the people getting time to register what we were doing, and I think the fact that we went in New York on the second year in 2015 really made us, without speaking, too humbly, but like a global brand, we became an international, art fair by going to New York, really, because we're quite a local, art fair by being in London. I think the fact that we're able to bring those artists with us on a more global stage by having a second edition with a second, hub of visibility, in a place like the US, really made us more international. Yeah,
no, that's amazing. And I've been to the shows, amazing collections, and it's always good to see, even people from where I'm from, Nigeria, come in there, get to showcase some amazing works. So you've really stepped up in bringing those to light. What has the art world, gotten wrong about the works of African artists, where you said, I'm going to come in and showcase the amazing pieces that I've seen around, the continent?
I think the first mistake, I think, that we had to really work on in changing this perception is when you were talking about contemporary African art. I think the world was thinking, of anthropology, like maybe the craft, the mask, the what they called at the time tribal art, like even those terms don't exist anymore. But when I started, they were still used, by institutions. And I think for most collectors, maybe not the curators, because they were definitely more in the scene, but for most collectors, they were associating, with this very narrow-minded perception of African art, with traditional art, classical art. And I think they couldn't understand or conceptualize that we're talking about contemporary art. So it gave them a very narrow view. Even when, they thought there was an African art fair, in London, they really thought about, they were going to see masks and objects. And I think this very, narrow view was one of the problems. The second problem was having an idea of a one Africa, one aesthetic, that, as you say, you're from Nigeria, you were excited.
It's a whole different vibe, from everybody else.
Artists and seeing the Nigerian galleries representing your artists, etc. I think a lot of people, when I was starting to talk about the project, about what we're doing, even in their conversation, they were like, yes, I've been to Africa. I was like, where? For them, it was a very...
Everything is in one,
and they thought that, the aesthetic of Nigeria would be the same as Morocco. And I think this was also a very important shift in perception. When they came to the fair, they went back with a very different perception of what, contemporary African art meant. But I think, unfortunately, I'm always surprised that there's still people who've never been to 154, based in London or in New York or, even in Marrakesh. And they still has this conception of at least, traditional art, which, to be honest, has inspired a lot of Western artists as well. But it's such a bigger segment, but this has been I want to say the one, I want to say, mistake of collectors and probably visitors, coming to 154 about, what it meant to work with contemporary African art, from the continent, from the diaspora.
Yeah, no, amazing. And it definitely makes sense. And I love how when you enter 154, you feel everybody's traditional vibe in each room. So it's good for people to experience that. Do you think the art market is catching up now to what African art is, or is it still behind and still dipping their toes a little bit, or they're now diving in?
In some ways, they're catching up. I think there's a lot of things that have completely changed since we started in a good way. People knowing some names, of contemporary artists from Africa that are now on people's lips, and they can say the names and that they've seen them here and there, and they have probably a good 5 or 6 names of contemporary African artists they know about, which they didn't know, 15 years ago. And also, I think, the fact that, they've seen the press, they've seen, the galleries representing artists. We had the chance also to have auction houses, who had dedicated, sales of contemporary African art. So if you're in the industry, you're definitely in a better place than you were 13 years ago in terms of visibility. Now, in terms of, what's missing and what, we still need to catch up with is, the fact that those museums, have to make sure that they are shifting their budget to include contemporary African art into their collection, not just do a show, but really make an effort with the intention to collect, those artists. I think the infrastructure, is lacking still. We still have very few galleries operating on the international level, either from the continent or, based outside, the continent. We have not so many galleries still today internationally representing artists from the continent and the African diaspora. So in many ways, those sales still represent a very tiny part of the market, as much as it is a huge difference than 14 years ago. If you take the total amount sales, and I would say public sales. So from the auctions, I mean, I was reading the market report, from Art Basel, that is one of the reference. They have this beautiful graph at the end, of all the sales, and where the biggest sales are happening, and like by region, by country, etc. And we're very excited about the UK being the second place where those big sales are happening. But Africa doesn't even figure as a percentage, in this report, So when you see that, you're thinking the journey is still very long, because obviously we know the I want to say the size of the continent, and therefore the size of talent, that we just even us scratching, when we do 154. So that it doesn't reflect properly, in this market report, shows how much work we still have to do.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about infrastructure, ecosystems, and even that small percentage, what do we need to do to get there to make it more dominant? What's the ecosystem in your brain and in your mind? What does that look like?
If we even want to replicate, even though I'm not a big fan of like wanting to replicate all the models, because if we would, I wouldn't have, done 154, it wouldn't have existed. But I think if you take the Western ecosystem of the world, of art, for example, and if you go in every country in the West, Western Europe or the US, even Asia, you would find, all those big countries with at least, I want to say hundreds of galleries. In the US, they have more museums than you can count. You have like the big public museum, you have the private museum, private foundation, private institutions, university museums, I mean, the numbers of museums they have by the square meter is crazy. So I think auction houses also, you have the big ones, but you have smaller ones that, also help with creating a value for the secondary market, which is really important, even if I deal with the primary market. But you do have all those numbers of curators, numbers of, residency program that exists for artists. I want to say scholarships maybe that you have for artists to go study abroad or locally, or programs, art programs locally. So I think the number one fact, definitely local collectors, because that's something that will not be sustainable if Africans don't collect African art, So I think this is pretty much a segment that needs to grow the fastest. So the livelihood of those artists are, kind of like sustainable. And then you definitely need, some infrastructure money to build institutions, so we don't also depend on the institution from the West, because institutions are very important, I want to say, in the journey of an artist in terms of recognition, appreciation, and also reference, for also the archive of the future, So I think it is very important that we also don't reproduce the mistakes that were done in the past, from a historical point, when we talk a lot about restitutions, for example, for the traditional art, a lot of the debates are about, do we have the infrastructure to hold those restitutions, today? And the reality, we should be able to say yes today. Yes, they will be safe, return them already. And contemporary art is very different, but I want to say that today, if I want to be fair, 95% of the art we sell are to foreigners, to international collectors, so we might have the same problem, go fast forward 20 years ago, when the big pieces of all those important artists will be abroad and not on the continent, when people with wealthy pockets in Africa could have bought them as well, but they didn't. So it is where we need to make sure that, it is more the sustainability of it that I'm more interested in than the fast success of it. Because it is important that all those things, grow in parallel. And I think, you think about an artist to be able to survive in this world and to be able to also practice only his art and like with some kind of like I want to say a peaceful mind, he can be like creative. He needs to have a support system, that supports his art. So I mean, he needs to have maybe curators interested in his work. He needs to have galleries, not one but 2 or 3 or 4, so he have a stream of revenue that is kind of like decent, and he can just do that without the worry of like being not only an entrepreneur but like not being able to feed his family family, so there's all those little things that are super important. So the ecosystem is something you probably build not in a year, but like, in 25 years, in 30 years, and it needs to be strong. And I think this is where I would like us to go now.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I'm having this conversation a lot in terms of sustainability in the art system, but also sustainability as an artist. A lot of artists, they don't want to think about the entrepreneurial side, which is fine because they really want to focus on their practice. How does an artist, from an artist point of view speaking, build sustainable careers in this space? I know you touched on a few points, but how do they do that?
Listen, I think they have to strategize, that's for sure. Like it's not just about creating nowadays, just because they are, first of all, I think their first own marketing tool, today with the social media and the access to all those new platforms, So first of all, I think information is available. So they really need to, think, how to build, their visibility. I think, to be honest, this is something that maybe is very undervalued, that I find it very true in the art world, is the network you have. That is extremely important and extremely useful. I think, even if the art world seems very structured from the outside world, from the inside, once you're inside, I think the personal relationship, who you meet, how do you, how people recognize you or remember you is very, very important. I think, having a gallery is still today, in this particular art market, very important if they do really well their job, because they're the one who will try to place you in institutions, they're the one who will probably publish a catalog, for you, and give you, stream of revenue that, unfortunately, usually it's every year or every 18 months, that you have a show with the gallery. So, it is, with some certainty, coming to you, you have a revenue per year, coming your way. But besides that, I think I've seen also a lot of artists today that come with their own audience, own network, own, they come to the gallery as a powerhouse already. And that's a new type of artist as well, and a new type of gallery that need to reception them in a way, because, if you're a gallery who was able to, if you're an artist of today who is able to sell his own art by himself, either through an agent or through his social media. He has a certain number of followers, because he's cool and he's able to do, to build his own audience, and he has one or two right connections that get him this visibility. When he gets to the gallery, he's doing a lot for the gallery already there. So the negotiation might be also moving into a very different, direction as well. But I think, to be honest, I would say I'm always impressed by artists who have done their research before even coming to the fair or coming to approach a gallery, or understanding, when we talk about ecosystem, understanding the different point of entry for him or for her, of course, because I think a lot of what I see missing sometimes is the information that is right there that the artist did not take the time to grasp. And I think that's something that I think the artists need. But I think in general, visibility is important. Understanding also that, this it's not my codes. Don't believe it. I didn't create those codes, but they are there. And sometimes you have to understand them to understand how it works, but I think, artists, for visibility, they have to also focus on their practice. And to do that, I would not underestimate the residency programs that you have around the world that you can apply or try to research, because residency programs are a door to curators, to probably maybe if you're based on the continent and you apply to residency abroad, they're also a door to Western institutions, and being able to talk about your work better, and being also part of the understanding, of what is an art fair. How many artists from the continent don't know what's on 154. They've heard about it, but they never actually experienced an art fair. We have also often different, our main, employees often come from the art world or art education, and some come from, a larger, broad audience. And often, they are also, because they're based in London or in New York, well ahead of knowing what's an art fair, for example, because they've been to art fairs, they're circulating about so they understand better the ecosystem. So even we had in the past artists wanting to have a sidekick job, like helping us with the fair. The fact is, it was their first experience in an art fair. Yeah. So they have a better understanding of the back office of their future career if they continue to pursue it. But I think the most educational artists are, in terms of trying to understand the world they're planning to have a journey is probably helping them understanding, how to make their career a success. Yeah. I would say also, and I also say that I don't like artists who compromise. I think as much as I want them to understand how the art world work today, I don't want them to compromise on their practice just to please the art world today. So it's a very difficult game, because they have to stay true to themselves, but at the same time understanding how what works for them, in this art world that can be in a way, layering a lot of barriers for you, but sometimes, help you getting forward, so you have to understand it. I mean, I try to understand the game to make 154, the platform it is today. Yeah. I try to copy the best model there is, my models are Art Basels, even if we're not the Art Basels of the world, but I want the aim of the galleries to be there, that consider us like the best show in town, and the best visibility for any artist that, would choose to be at 154.
So what does the future of cultural platforms look like beyond art fairs?
I definitely think that a platform, has different portfolio of things to offer, for artists, for galleries. And I think it's definitely something for me that I want to see, that is not just a 4 days event, It has to be a year-long program where there's activations, there's definitely education, there's, programming that is engaging, not only the collector part of things, but the artists and the people who are interested in engaging with artists from Africa and the African diaspora. But I definitely think that the main thing is having a portfolio of services, that will provide services to first the artists, because they are the content of this thing and of this machine, and then obviously to galleries, that I think they're still going to be useful because they still gather people. And I think if you think about how the world is going today, where people are more and more isolated and more with their digital tools, I think those events are going to be moment of experiences, of discovering, live events in a way where you're taking off from your digital world to actually come experience a human experience. So I think there will still be a place where you will gather, mix, connect, but definitely they're not going to be the only place, where you're going to sell, where you're going to, transact, this is going to be one of the I want to say the streams of things you can go to. I feel like the platforms is something that needs to evolve, and the art fairs need to evolve, because we're entering a world that is definitely much more digital, so you want to make sure that the world is the world we live in the art world, is going towards also in a way, where the world is going. You can't be isolated in your little bubble, where you don't think the art world is going to change. It is going to change, and you have to be adaptable. And I think with us being such a flexible platform, because we had to be a flexible platform, it is also something that we are thinking all the time, is how do you still stay relevant, for the artists, for the galleries,
Yeah.
where is the market going, with, this cycle. I think this year, 2 years ago, to be fair, like we've been in an up cycle for like almost 14 years, because we came from discovery to like our peak exciting, moment, to now the whole art world is slowing down, so we are obviously following this art world, the slowing down. And it's not the African art world that's slowing down, it's the whole art world that is slowing down. And I think the reality of the transaction shows that the transactions are not slowing down. You have a lot of work that are being sold, in exactly the price range that we are contributing, to the global stage. But it is really about, how is the future, is being it's being set up for us. And I think we see, the AI tools, that are entering everybody's life today, for very different things. And we hope the creative side, will continue to be human-led rather than AI-led. But at the same time, I think those are tools even for the artist that he'll be able to use, for his admin, that is going to give him a huge, he's going to be able to have a huge number of time returned to him, in terms of focusing more on creativity rather than all the archiving and the admin he might have to do, for his work, and maybe all the assistant type of work, anybody has to do when they are the sole businessman of their enterprise, But at the same time, I think, we've experienced it with COVID, which started it, but we still see it, really playing a huge role today is all digital platforms. We know our gallery sells a lot on PDF already. I think we are, seeing a lot of our we do a lot of pre-sales work for the art fair, when we have the final list of work, for all the fair, we do sell a lot, online by exchanging emails with collectors, etc. We truly want it to still be a live experience. This is something that you're not changing. Your experience in front of a live piece of work is definitely not the same as seeing, a piece of work on a PDF. But there is a lot of that. It exists, it happens. You like it or not, it is really happening. But I do feel that, the platform of an art fair is also a place where you have, this meeting point of curators, institutions, collectors, art lovers, students, all meeting under the same roof at the same time to experience something. And they will have emotions that are, felt because they're discovering this art physically and not digitally, And I think those connections, are definitely a very unique thing that is what an art fair is bringing on the table. But I do believe that the future art fair is a mixture of being an art fair, an all year long platform that might even in our case, we've seen it, I feel like there's more of live experiences that needs to still to happen, because I think this is where people are converging to, where they really want to meet and see each other, and I know that we've experienced this, with the travel experience we did this year, where we brought collectors, curators with us to Sao Paulo, to discover the Afro-Brazilian art scene, and I think those collectors' experiences during this trip was very unique. They're still very linked together, we're still all texting each other, meeting in other things. So I think there's going to be live experiences, in the future of 154, but maybe not, just in those three this three destination, which is New York, London, and Marrakesh, which I think I'll continue to do. But like I think in between there's going to be, how do you discover maybe artist studios, more? And I think those are the most successful, part of the programs when we launch them. When we have what we call VIP programs or whatever for the fair, the most attended experiences are the ones where you can provide something very unique. And something very unique is like meeting the artist in real life, going to his studio, seeing his practice, and maybe it's in the places of the fair, but maybe it's outside, the destinations of the fair. Maybe it's bringing people to the continent, like it's getting them to see art in situ, like we do in Marrakesh, but into the different places, on the continent. So I think for us, the future is always around, visibility and support for artists from the continent and the African diaspora. But like at the end, it doesn't have to take, the form of an art fair.
I want to talk about the New York edition that's coming up. You said you're doing something unique in that. Tell us more about it. It's happening pretty soon. What's happening behind that?
So 154 New York, has started in 2015, as I said, 2 years after our big launch in London. And, we have evolved already in New York, in terms of the type of audience we're targeting there, but also in terms of the art we present. I want to say the evolution has a bit changed, not because of where New York is, but also because of, our own ecosystem of galleries and what they're able to do, not do, on the continent, the shipping cost to New York, But we also felt that New York was also a great platform to play with the diaspora aspect of things. In some cases, we've been pushed to kind of make sure that people understood we're not just about Africa, but like about the African diaspora, which took a very large definition of it. So in New York, for some reason, over the years, because of also the distance between Africa and the US, it has been also something we have evolved in, where, we see more galleries either from Europe or from the US participating in New York, but with artists from Africa and the African diaspora. We also see, galleries from the US having, since day one, being much more keen to present artists from African American descent, So in New York this year, we have a very large contingent of galleries and, a select, galleries and special projects that are either coming from the Caribbean. And this year, the first time we launch it in New York, and I hope it's the first chapter of many chapters, but we have a section of Afro-Brazilian artists. And it's a bit deriving from our experience in Sao Paulo and our discovery there. But it's also because, we came in discovering, the same exact story that, artists from the African continent have experienced all their life in Brazil. Like the largest population of Black people is in Brazil, after Africa. They probably have some of the largest number of artists that are from Afro descent.
Yeah.
But they have been ignored all this time, and now, having few galleries that are the major galleries, allowing them to enter the market. And there's always gatekeepers, everywhere.
Yeah,
They are international in every country. And I think the idea of having also this large population that is actually so linked to Africa, it's unbelievable. That was my first discovery, is like going to Brazil for the first time and seeing this. First of all, I'm not saying that because you're Nigerian, but direct link with Nigeria.
Yeah, there's I can't remember what it is, but the comments will let me know. There's a celebration that they have, and there's a lot of Yoruba traditions in there. I took my mum and dad to a Brazilian restaurant, and they were looking at the food. They were like, "That's that." So it's heavily linked there. And our surname, one of my surnames, Sanusi. There's a bunch of Sanusis in Brazil, so the links are incredible.
Are so strong. And I have to say, not that I ignored them. I knew they were there because of the histories of that we know about. But I actually, to see it so present and so well preserved was a real eye-opener, because, we met artists, went to studios, where we even had the chance to have, rituals, Yoruba rituals, of what they call Brazilian artists, but that were from the Afro descent. So for us, we are extremely excited about bringing these experiences, to New York. And we've been experiencing with, having different selected projects on Caribbean, over at least 3 or 4 years. So this is like a very integrated part of New York, but the section curated by a curator from African descent, to this section, to the New York audience is very important to us. And I feel like this is one of our highlight. The market in New York is very special right now because it is also experiencing quite a slow cycle. So we are very excited also to share for the first time, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but, in New York, one of our major challenge over the years is the real estate. And apparently it's a very common thing in New York, but like we've been changing venues compared to Somerset House that we have as a spiritual home, and La Mamounia in Marrakesh that we had for now 7 years. In New York, we've been like nomads. We've experienced every neighborhood, from Harlem to the financial district, from Brooklyn. I think we covered most of the boroughs. Maybe Queens we didn't do, but maybe it's in the future. So we are back in Chelsea, which we experienced before, which is great. But we're sharing also a building with an art fair that is quite, established, called Nada. That is also very, very much into, experiencing and supporting, the emerging galleries and emerging artists. So this is for us, I think, a very new exciting addition, because I think we're going to be able to, share audiences. And I think the more visibility we get, the better. And then, we have amazing galleries that never done 154 before, that is always cool to bring, to the table. We have a gallery from London called Blonde Contemporary that is doing the fair and trusting us with their first show with us in New York, and they're bringing different South African artists that we never had on the table. They're also bringing a super cool Moroccan artist, that, funny enough, grew up in the US. She's Moroccan, but her talent is crazy because she is completely influenced by a very special school, of this little tiny village in Morocco. And I don't know how, this, I know she's Moroccan, but I don't think she hang out with those side of artists. She's based in Brooklyn. But I was so impressed by seeing her very cool work that is honestly remind everyone, that knows the different Moroccan school, about this school of Essaouira, which is a very naive school that that does things a bit like the Australian art with little dots, so that's very exciting for me. But most of the fair, the VIP program, we have amazing studios, artist opening. It is very cool to be in New York, with this visibility when you have, all the big fairs in town. It's a particular week. It's the week of Freeze, but also of Tifaf. You have Nada happening in the same building where you have us. You have another another art fair called The Independent that is a super cool art fair, but then you have all the big sales from the auction. So it's important for us to be
in that energy,
in that moment, for the artists, for the visibility, for everything. And then as soon as this finish, we go back with our hat for London. It's a bit of our life, like going around. But in the meantime, there's the Biennale of Venice that is happening even before us, and this year it's a very important year. It's I'm very proud to say it because this is part of our early journey on, Koyo Kuo, who passed away, who's the director of this Biennale. Unfortunately, she won't be there physically, to be there with us. But, the Biennale of Venice is like the biggest accolade that any artist from Africa can have, to be chosen in that roster. When you told me, what would make a difference in an artist's life, to be chosen for a Biennale of Venice is like you arrived, you achieved, you played the rules until the end, and you have this, kind of like badge of honor. You've done the Biennale of Venice. And even for a curator, it's a bit of the same thing. If you're able to have reached, to be chosen ever to become the director of the Biennale of Venice, is like you also achieved the biggest accolade, as a curator. What is beautiful for me is Koyo started with me 154, and she was one of the first curator that created the the educational program of 154 that we call the 154 Forum. She worked with us for 6 years. A lot of those artists, and there's a few of them, in this Biennale that she had listed before she passed away, came from 154. So those are artists that have started all their journeys with 154. So for me also, this is not only a beautiful part because it's before New York. Sorry, I'm jumping, but like this is also for me a big moment because we have this, I want to say, recognition of a large number of artists and where they are today that have been chosen, to be part of this big show. And then you have all the international, and African pavilion that also representing a lot of artists that have been at 154. So for me, it's a bit of like a check. Yeah. We've done a good job, in bringing them, in making those connections happen, that are happening. So I think New York will be a bit of a celebration of that, because it will be very fresh, in everybody's mind, on how exciting, maybe Africa has become, to have a curator who was from the continent, that is creating the Biennale of Venice. But also, I think it's one of the largest representation of African and African diaspora artists of any Biennale of the world, that we will experience in a week time, So it is very exciting to be part of it and to, continue to celebrate it with 154 New York in New York.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It's super inspiring. I'm going to leave with one final question. What does success in the art world look like for you today?
I mean, for me, it's definitely, having this automatic, integration of even our galleries to be automatically chosen, in larger art fair, to have artists automatically chosen, to be part of a, more global exhibition, not a very focused African type, exhibitions, or to have enough scholars, to be ready to archive and talk and do publications, on those artists. To make our role obsolete, really, like where you don't need 154, that everything is done so well that we don't have to worry about all those things. And of course, have enough collectors locally, and infrastructure locally that will, change the game of, those artists for the long term, not just, the time of a fair.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Touria. Really appreciate
You're welcome, Ade. Thank you for having me.
No worries. All good. Thank you.